Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! As the mirror fogged with the cool autumn breeze, Alexander's reflection revealed a transformative endeavor. He stared, captivated by the intricate pearl necklace, a treasured heirloom from their grandmother. It adorned a figure unrecognizable, no longer the Alexander who lived up to societal norms. His once wavy, sandy hair now flowed gracefully down his back, a contrast to the ruggedness he'd embraced. The skilled application of makeup softened his features, honing elegance. The familiar touch of stubble, now absent, left his jawline smooth and unfamiliar. A whisper, delicate yet determined, carried across the room.
Alexander, indeed, this is your destiny.
The anticipation of impending revelation weighed heavily, comparable to the tangible chill on Alexander's skin. Yet within this burden lay the promise of liberation. Just weeks ago, he'd been Alexander Blackwood, a promising young lawyer with a secret gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control. Now, he stood in his childhood home, about to step into the shoes of Alexandra Blackwood, his twin sister, who had tragically passed away in a car accident 2 months prior. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been racking up insurmountable debts at underground poker games, Alexandra had been building a successful career and amassing a considerable fortune. And now, in a twist of fate that felt like cosmic punishment, he was forced to become her to save himself from financial ruin and potential harm from his creditors. A knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. "Alexandra, darling, are you ready? The lawyer's waiting downstairs to go over the will." It was his mother's voice, laced with the grief that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. Alexander cleared his throat, praying his voice wouldn't betray him.
Just a moment, Mother. I'll be right down.
He smoothed down the burgundy dress he wore, feeling the unfamiliar contours of his body beneath the fabric. With a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. His mother stood there, her eyes red-rimmed, but warm. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, pulling him into an embrace. "I know how hard this must be for you." Alexander stiffened for a moment, before forcing himself to relax into the hug. The scent of his mother's perfume, a floral fragrance she'd worn for as long as he could remember, brought a lump to his throat. Guilt gnawed at him. He was deceiving the woman who had raised him, who was already suffering from the loss of her daughter.
"It's difficult,"
he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper.
"But we'll get through this together, won't we?"
His mother nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue.
"Of course we will. Your father and I are here for you, always."
As they descended the grand staircase, Alexander's mind raced. He'd spent the past week studying Alexandra's mannerisms, her way of speaking, even practicing her signature. But would it be enough to fool the people who had known her all her life? In the study, his father and the family lawyer, Mr. Harrington, were waiting. His father's face was a mask of stoic grief, but his eyes softened as they fell upon Alexander.
"Alexandra,"
he said, rising to greet them.
"How are you holding up, sweetheart?"
Alexander swallowed hard.
"As well as can be expected, Father,"
he replied, hoping his nervousness would be mistaken for sorrow. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat.
"Shall we begin?"
he asked, gesturing to the chairs arranged around his father's imposing mahogany desk. As they settled into their seats, Alexander's heart pounded so loudly he was sure the others could hear it. This was the moment of truth. If he could get through this meeting, He might just pull off this desperate charade. The lawyer began to read through the will, detailing Alexandra's considerable assets. Alexander listened with a mixture of awe and shame. His sister had accomplished so much in her short life, while he had squandered his opportunities and ended up in this impossible situation.
And finally,
Mr. Harrington said,
the bulk of Alexandra's estate, including her investments and property holdings, will be placed in a trust. Alexandra will have full control of this trust upon her 30th birthday, which, as we know, is just a few months away.
Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known about this stipulation. A few months. He would have to maintain this deception for months.
Until then,
the lawyer continued,
a monthly allowance will be provided for living expenses, and any major financial decisions will need to be approved by the trustees, in this case, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood.
His parents nodded solemnly, and Alexander forced himself to do the same. Inside, his mind was reeling. This complicated things significantly. He had hoped to access the funds quickly, pay off his debts, and find a way to extract himself from this situation. Now he was looking at a long-term performance, one that would require him to fool not just his family and friends, but potentially business associates and financial advisors as well. As the meeting concluded, Alexander found himself being embraced once again, this time by his father. The man's strong arms encircled him, and for a moment, Alexander was transported back to his childhood, when those same arms had made him feel safe and protected.
We're here for you, Alexandra,
his father murmured.
Whatever you need.
The words, meant to comfort, only intensified Alexander's guilt. He mumbled his thanks and excused himself, claiming he needed some air. In the garden behind the house, Alexander paced back and forth, the heels of his shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. The cool air helped clear his head, but it did nothing to alleviate the weight of his deception. He thought about Alexandra, really thought about her for the first time since her death. They had drifted apart in recent years, his gambling addiction driving a wedge between them. She had tried to help him, to make him see reason, but he had pushed her away, too ashamed to admit the depth of his problem. Now, as he stood in her garden, wearing her clothes, about to step into her life, he felt a wave of grief wash over him. Not just for the sister he had lost, but for the relationship they could have had if he hadn't been so foolish.
I'm sorry, Alex,
he whispered, using the nickname he had called her when they were children.
I'm so sorry.
A rustle in the nearby bushes startled him. He turned to see a familiar figure emerge. Emily, Alexandra's best friend since college. There you are, Emily said, her voice gentle. Your mom said you might be out here. Alexander's heart raced. Emily knew Alexandra better than anyone. If anyone was going to see through his deception, it would be her.
Emily,
he said, trying to infuse his voice with the warmth Alexandra would have shown her friend. I didn't know you were coming over. Emily stepped closer, her green eyes filled with concern. I wanted to check on you. I know today must be tough, with the will reading and everything. Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Emily reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? She said. I mean, I know I'm not him, but I'm here for you. Confusion flickered across Alexander's face before he could stop it.
Him?
He asked, before he could think better of it. Emily's brow furrowed. You know, Alexander, I know how worried you were about him before. before the accident. Have you heard from him? Alexander felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. In all his frantic preparation, he had completely forgotten about himself, or rather about Alexander. As far as the world knew, Alexandra's twin brother was still alive, just conveniently absent.
No,
he managed to say, his mind racing. No, I haven't heard from him. Emily's frown deepened. That's not like him. I know you two had your issues, but to not even call after everything. Do you want me to try reaching out to him? No, Alexander said, too quickly. He took a breath, trying to compose himself.
No, thank you. I'm sure he'll get in touch when he's ready. You know how he can be.
Emily nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced.
All right, if you're sure. But remember, you don't have to go through this alone. We're all here for you.
As Emily pulled him into a hug, Alexander felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for the friendship Alexandra had cultivated, guilt for deceiving someone who clearly cared deeply, and a growing realization of just how complicated this charade was going to be. Over the next few weeks, Alexander threw himself into learning every aspect of Alexandra's life. He pored over her diaries, studied her social media accounts, and even practiced her handwriting for hours on end. Every day was a new challenge, a constant performance where one misstep could bring his entire world crashing down. He learned to apply makeup, to walk in heels without stumbling, to modulate his voice to match Alexandra's softer tones. He immersed himself in her work, studying the intricacies of the charities she supported and the investments she managed. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but he had no choice but to persist. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself experiencing something unexpected, a growing connection to Alexandra. Through her writings and the stories shared by friends and family, he began to see his sister in a new light. He learned of her struggles, her triumphs, her hopes and fears. It was as if, in death, she was becoming more real to him than she had been in life. One evening, as he sat at Alexandra's vanity, carefully removing his makeup, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. For a moment, he saw not himself, not the facade of Alexandra he had created, but a blend of the two. It was disconcerting, this blurring of identities. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts.
Alexandra?
His mother's voice called.
Are you decent? I'd like to talk to you about something.
Alexander quickly pulled on a robe over his nightgown.
Come in, Mother,
he called, his heart racing as it did every time he had to interact with someone from Alexandra's life. His mother entered, a sad smile on her face. She sat on the edge of the bed, patting the space beside her. Alexander joined her, trying to ignore the strangeness of sitting with his mother while dressed as his sister.
I've been thinking, his mother began, about the charity gala next month. I know you were planning to attend, to announce the new scholarship program in Alexander's name. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He had seen the event mentioned in Alexandra's planner, but hadn't given it much thought. Now, he realized the magnitude of what he was facing. The scholarship program?
He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His mother nodded.
Yes, the one you've been working on for months, to help young people struggling with addiction, in honor of your brother.
She paused, her eyes filling with tears.
I know it must be hard, thinking about Alexander, especially when he hasn't even reached out since we lost you. But I think this program could really make a difference.
Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the gut. All this time, he had been so focused on becoming Alexandra, on maintaining the charade to save himself, that he had never stopped to consider the impact of his actions, of Alexander's actions, on his family.
I'm not sure I can do it, Mother,
he said, his voice barely above a whisper.
To stand up there and talk about him. It's too much.
His mother reached out, taking his hand in hers.
I know it's difficult, sweetheart. But you've worked so hard on this. And who knows? Maybe this will be what brings Alexander home. He might see how much you care. How much we all care.
Alexander felt tears welling up in his eyes, and for once, he didn't try to hold them back. They weren't Alexandra's tears, or even the tears of the persona he had created. They were his own, Alexander's tears, filled with regret and shame and a desperate longing to make things right.
You're right,
he said finally, squeezing his mother's hand. I'll do it. For Alexander. As his mother left the room, Alexander sat alone in the growing darkness. He had started this charade to escape his debts, to save himself from the consequences of his actions. But now, he realized, he had been given an opportunity to make amends, to do something good in Alexandra's name, and perhaps to find a way to reconcile the two halves of himself that were becoming increasingly blurred. The next morning, Alexander woke early, his mind still churning with thoughts of the upcoming gala and the scholarship program. He dressed carefully in a pale blue blouse and gray skirt, taking extra time with his makeup to ensure he looked as polished and professional as Alexandra always had. As he made his way downstairs, he overheard voices coming from his father's study. He paused at the door, listening.
I'm worried about her, James, his mother was saying. She's been so different since the accident. Withdrawn. Almost like she's a different person. She's grieving, Margaret, his father replied. We all are. Alexandra and Alexander were always so close. Losing him, and then nearly losing her in that accident, it's bound to change a person.
Alexander felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't realized how much his performance as Alexandra was affecting his parents. He had been so focused on maintaining the deception that he hadn't considered how Alexandra would have truly acted in the wake of her own near-death experience and the supposed disappearance of her brother. He cleared his throat and knocked on the doorframe.
Good morning,
he said, forcing a small smile.
I hope I'm not interrupting.
His parents turned to him, their faces immediately brightening.
Not at all, sweetheart,
his mother said. We were just discussing the gala. Are you sure you're up for it? Alexander nodded, stepping into the room.
I am. I've been thinking about it all night, actually. I want to do this. For Alexander, and for all the people this scholarship could help.
His father stood, crossing the room to place a hand on his shoulder.
We're proud of you, Alexandra. Your brother would be too.
The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He swallowed hard, fighting back tears.
Thank you,
he managed to say.
I hope so.
Over the next few weeks, Alexander threw himself into preparations for the gala. He met with the event planners, reviewed the guest list, and worked on his speech. Each task brought new challenges, new opportunities for his deception to be discovered, but also new insights into the person Alexandra had been. He found himself genuinely moved by the scholarship program she had designed. It wasn't just about addiction. It was about second chances, about believing in people even when they couldn't believe in themselves. He he realized with a start. Exactly what Alexandra had tried to do for him before her death. As the day of the gala approached, Alexander found himself spending more and more time in Alexandra's closet, trying to decide what to wear. It wasn't just about looking the part anymore. He wanted to honor his sister, to present himself in a way that would make her proud. Finally, he settled on a deep emerald green gown that Alexandra had worn to her college graduation. It was elegant and understated, perfectly suited for the occasion. As he slipped it on, adjusting the fabric over his altered body, he caught sight of himself in the full-length mirror. For a moment, he didn't see Alexander pretending to be Alexandra. He saw a person who was neither fully one nor the other, but something in between. Someone carrying the best parts of both siblings, striving to make amends and do something good in the world. The night of the gala arrived, and Alexander found himself standing at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces. Some were familiar, family friends, business associates, people who had known Alexandra all her life. Others were strangers, drawn by the promise of a new charitable initiative. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the microphone. This was it, the moment of truth.
"Good evening, everyone,"
he began, his voice steady despite his nerves.
"Thank you all for coming tonight. As many of you know, the past few months have been challenging, to say the least."
He paused, looking out at the crowd. In the front row, he could see his parents, their faces a mixture of pride and lingering sorrow. Beside them sat Emily, her eyes encouraging.
"We're here tonight to talk about second chances,"
he continued, "about the power of belief and the transformative impact it can have on a person's life. The Alexander Blackwood Second Chance Scholarship isn't just about helping people overcome addiction. It's about showing them that they are more than their mistakes, that they have value and potential, even when they can't see it themselves." As he spoke, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The words weren't just part of his act anymore. They were coming from a place of genuine emotion, of hard-won understanding.
"I stand before you today as someone who knows the value of a second chance,"
he said, his voice thick with emotion.
"My brother, Alexander, he struggled with addiction for years, and I didn't always know how to help him. Sometimes I didn't even try."
A hush fell over the room. This wasn't part of the prepared speech, but Alexander couldn't stop the words from pouring out.
"But I've come to realize that it's never too late to make things right, to offer forgiveness, to extend a helping hand. That's what this scholarship is about. It's about saying to someone who's lost their way, 'We see you, we believe in you, and we're here to help you find your path again.'"
As he concluded his speech, announcing the details of the scholarship and the first round of recipients, Alexander felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since he had begun this charade, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. The applause was thunderous. As he stepped down from the podium, he was immediately engulfed in a sea of well-wishers. His parents hugged him tightly, tears in their eyes. "Alexandra, that was beautiful," his mother whispered. "Your brother would be so proud." Alexander nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As he made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, he caught sight of a familiar face at the back of the room. It was Mr. Chen, one of the men he owed money to, the man who had threatened him, who had been the catalyst for this entire deception. Alexander felt his heart rate spike, fear coursing through him. But as their eyes met, Mr. Chen simply nodded, a look of grudging respect on his face. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Alexander stood there, stunned. He didn't know what this meant, if his debts were forgiven, or if there was some other plan in motion. But in that moment, he realized something important. He had started this journey as Alexander, desperate and afraid. He had continued it as a facsimile of Alexandra, driven by necessity and guilt. But now, he was becoming someone new, someone who carried the best parts of both siblings, someone who had the potential to make real, positive change in the world. As the gala wound down, Alexander found himself on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how long he could maintain this dual existence, or what would happen when the truth eventually came out. But he did know one thing. Whatever came next, he would face it not as Alexander or Alexandra, but as the person he was becoming. A person who understood the value of second chances, of forgiveness, of striving to be better than you were yesterday. And, for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.
Thanks for watching, my girlies. Be sure to check out Patreon for more.